What's going on, guys? Welcome back to my channel, where today we have our wide receiver stardom sit-em for week 15. The playoffs are here. I haven't done one of these in a while, but we're going to go ahead and we're going to get started with this. We're going to see if we can win you guys a fantasy championship. First up, we have the Vikings and the Bengals. Now, Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase, they're obviously starts if they play. Justin Jefferson, he's dealing with an injury, but regardless of his QB situation, the guy's just too good not to produce. He's going to command targets from this offense. The Bengals do allow the 16th most points per game to wide receivers with just a little under 34, and they allow the 7th most receiving yards to wide receivers with 2,194. Now, Jamar Chase is the number 5 fantasy wide receiver. He's a huge part of the Cincinnati offense. The Vikings allowed the 12th most points per game to wide receivers with 35.5 just about, and they allowed the 12th most receiving yards to wide receivers with 2,124. Now, as for T. Higgins and Jordan Addison, they both are dealing with backup quarterbacks, and they're the number 2. They're overshadowed by their superstar counterparts. Addison, especially onto his third quarterback, he's just not fantasy viable. Higgins is currently having a down season for him, and without their consistent starting quarterbacks, their stars, I wouldn't bet on either of them to produce and create that playoff win for you. Next up, we have the Colts versus the Steelers. Now, we're going to start Michael Pittman. He's actually having a sneakily good fantasy season. He's currently the number 11 fantasy wide receiver. He has the second most targets of all wide receivers this season with 135. He's commanded at least 11 targets in 5 of the last 6 weeks. He's been so good, you can't really afford to sit him, especially against the Steelers, who are in shambles. Now, as for George Pickens and Deontay Johnson, the Colts allowed the 11th least points per game to wide receivers with just under 31, and they've been very inconsistent in this offense. They had cold streak issues. They're not putting up points like they pretty much were expected to, especially George Pickens. And Trubisky creates issues for both of them. Neither of them are above wide receiver 35, so there is really no reason to start either of them, especially when you're trying to win a playoff game. Next up, we have the Lions versus the Broncos, and this is going to sound weird, but I'm going to start Amon-Ra St. Brown, even though his stats are telling me to sit him. Everything is telling me that Amon-Ra St. Brown needs to be sat. Like, the Broncos had the 5th least points per game given up to wide receivers with 28. They've allowed the 2nd least points per game to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks with just over 22. He's coming off of consecutively poor weeks with 2 and 3 catches, but he's the number 8 fantasy wide receiver. His stats are all saying that, hey, this guy needs to be sat, but you're in a position where you can't really afford to sit him because he's been so good that you kind of need him to go off in order to win your championship. As for Courtland Sutton, he has had 10 touchdowns this season, 7 in the last 8 weeks, and the Lions allowed the 10th most points per game to wide receivers with 36.35, but he's very much touchdown dependent. He's not grabbing really enough yards or catches to warrant starting this week, and I think that the Lions might have a little bit of hope in shutting him down. So I really don't want to start him this week over some of these other guys that might give you a better edge. Next up, we have what is a disgusting game in the Panthers versus the Falcons, otherwise known as the Tank Division. Yeah, this game is going to be really, really bad. You're going to want to sit both Drake London and Adam Thielen. The Panthers allow the 6th least points per game to wide receivers with just over 28. He has too many inconsistent weeks to be fantasy relevant. He's number 35 fantasy wide receiver. In a defensive division game, it should mean low scoring and it shouldn't provide many opportunities for him. Same thing goes with Adam Thielen. The Falcons are actually a little better. They are the 3rd least points per game to wide receivers. That's kind of backwards. He's the number 14 fantasy wide receiver, though. The Panthers' offense has been struggling. They're not going to bounce back, and if they do, it's going to be in a very low-scoring affair. Adam Thielen just hasn't been very good over the last couple of weeks, so I don't see either of them producing. Please just leave them on your bench for the love of God. Up next, we have the Packers and the Buccaneers. We're going to go ahead and start Mike Evans. He's the number 9 fantasy wide receiver. He's actually so underrated, it's pretty insane. He's Baker Mayfield's favorite target. He's looking for a bounce back after he scored 1 point last week. Packers do allow the 8th least points per game to wide receivers, but he is consistently the red zone target. He almost had the touchdown last game, but he couldn't get his feet in bounds, and that's pretty much his most consistent thing. He's always producing. That's just who Mike Evans is, so I would start him. As for the Packers wide receivers, the Buccaneers do allow the 6th most points per game to wide receivers, but you don't know which wide receiver will really pop off in this offense. You have 3 of them. Dobbs, Watson, Reed. They trade off weeks where they find success. None of them are above wide receiver 37, and there's too many mouths to feed, so it's pretty annoying trying to start them, and especially getting them wrong. As for Chris Godwin, he's on 6 straight weeks of 10 points or less. He's the number 36 fantasy wide receiver. He's only got 1 touchdown this season, and he's not producing enough catches, touchdowns, or yards really to be fantasy relevant, and especially not in the playoffs. Up next, we have the Browns versus the Bears, and again, another interesting one. I'm starting DJ Moore, but the Browns allow the 2nd least points per game to wide receivers. He is the number 7 fantasy wide receiver. He has 3 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. He has 3 straight weeks of 22 points or more. If this was any other week, I would be sitting DJ Moore versus the Browns, but it's the playoffs and risks have to be made. There are going to be some really consistent teams, and you can't afford to sit DJ Moore and have him just kind of pop off on your bench in the off chance that that does happen. As for Amari Cooper, the Bears have picked up their defense a lot. They now allow the 16th least points per game to wide receivers with a little over 33. He's super inconsistent with points despite a very large target share. He's the number 30 fantasy wide receiver. And over the last 4 weeks, the Bears have gone to 12th least points per game to wide receivers with just barely over 30. Amari Cooper is not in a position right now to be fantasy relevant until he proves otherwise, maybe next week. Divisional matchup between the Dolphins and the Jets up next, and we're going to start Garrett Wilson, who's the number 21 fantasy wide receiver. He's had double-digit targets in 6 of the last 8 weeks. He's statistically about to surpass his last season 3 weeks early. He's facing Miami, who's given up tied 6th most touchdowns to wide receivers with 13. He looks to be a high-end wide receiver 1 this week, especially if Zach Wilson continues to play how he did last week. Tyreek Hill, come on, he's the number 2 fantasy player, number 1 fantasy wide receiver. He starts no matter who he's playing, where he's playing. Doesn't matter, there's not any other option. He has 1,500 yards and 12 touchdowns this season. That's it. Jalen Waddle, he's the number 31 fantasy wide receiver, so we're going to sit him. He's got 8 catches and 114 yards versus the Jets a couple weeks ago, but they allowed the least points per game to wide receivers with 21.6. That's 6 less than the Browns, who are the 2nd lowest, and the Jets have allowed the least touchdowns to wide receivers with 3. The next lowest of that total has 8. Jalen Waddle is not in a position here to be successful, and I wouldn't bet on Miami's offense completely destroying the Jets. Up next, we have the Patriots versus the Chiefs, an old-time classic without Brady, but we're going to go ahead and start Rashee Rice. He's beginning to establish himself as the number 1 Mahomes receiver. He has at least 14 points in the last 3 weeks. He's averaged 10 targets, 8 catches, 80 yards over those 3 weeks, and New England now allows the 12th most points per game to wide receivers with 35. He's getting red hot for the playoffs. If you've been waiting to unleash Rashee Rice, now is the time to do it. As for New England's wide receivers, no shock here. The offense just isn't good. You're not going to start any of these guys. There are 3 guys that could either score 13 points or score 5 points. I don't think there's an established number 1 wide receiver here, and all 3 of them are number 67 wide receiver or worse. There's no point in starting these guys. Do not risk your fantasy playoffs for it. Up next, we have the Saints versus the Giants. Chris Olave is definitely going to be a start. The Giants allow the 3rd most points per game to wide receivers with 39 even. He's currently the number 17 fantasy wide receiver with super inconsistency at quarterback. He scored at least 12 points in the last 5 weeks. I think this is his breakout game. I think that this is his game to really shine and really lead us. As for the New York Giants, there's a huge question mark in the wide receiver room. The Saints allow the 4th least points per game to wide receivers with a little over 28. And DeVito, as good as he's been, gabba-da-boo, gabba-da-gee, you know what I mean? But, yeah, he's not throwing for 200 yards. No wide receiver is worth that fantasy value. The highest New York Giants wide receiver is valued at 7 points projected. That is insanely low, and if you have him starting in a playoff game, I feel bad for you. Up next, yet another divisional matchup between the Titans and the Texans. We're going to start both these guys. Nico Collins is in a great position here. The Titans have given up the most receiving yards to wide receiver over the last 4 weeks with 914. He's currently the number 12 fantasy wide receiver. If he does play, he is their number 1 option, and it's not close. But CJ Stroud is dealing with a concussion. He shouldn't really play that much of a factor as far as Nico Collins' production, though. I think even with Davis Mills in there, Collins will be a force in that offense, and he should be force-fed. As for Hopkins, the Texans allow the 14th least points per game to wide receivers with just barely over 32. He has at least 15 points in 3 of the last 4 weeks. The Texans have given up the 5th most yards to wide receiver over the last 4 games, and Hopkins and Henry are really the only options in this offense. Hopkins is really stepping out into his own, finding space, creating opportunities for himself to score, and I think that Will Levis is finally seeing those opportunities and making the most of what Hopkins is creating for himself. Up next, we have the San Francisco 49ers taking on the Arizona Cardinals. Go ahead and start the entire San Francisco offense. Let's be honest here. Brandon Ayuk and Deebo Samuel, pretty simple. Cardinals give up a lot of points, 13th most to wide receivers, and they've been putting on a show over the last 4 weeks. Brock Purdy has been heavily in the MVP conversation, and because of that, he's obviously creating more opportunities for his wide receivers and his tight end. They've both been clicking and scoring a lot of points, like 20 each week. It's kind of crazy. These guys should have plenty of opportunities to go crazy against a mediocre Cardinals team. I would start them both. As for Marquise Brown, the 49ers do give up a lot of points to wide receivers with 37.5, but he's only caught 50% of his targets this year, 51 out of 101. That's crazy. He's dealing with a heel injury. He's number 39 wide receiver in fantasy. He has 1 game over 7 points in the last 5 weeks. There is absolutely no reason to start him this week. I'm sorry, but there just isn't. Rams versus the Commanders are up next, and we've got Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp. Obviously, we're going to start both these guys. Washington's pass defense is horrible. They give up over 40 points per game to wide receivers. Puka is number 10 currently in fantasy. He has an elite matchup this week. He's going to get back on track. He must be started. Cooper Kupp as well. He's had multiple bad weeks, but he's found his rhythm here in the last 2 weeks, and he is Stafford's favorite target, whether we like it or not, when he's in the offense. That's just what it is. Terry McLaurin, the Rams give up the 16th most points per game to wide receivers with 33.5. He's having a really tragic fantasy season. He has 4 consecutive weeks under 10 points, wide receiver number 34 in fantasy. He has a big regression this season fantasy-wise, and it's crazy, especially considering that Sam Howell has been so fantasy efficient that Terry McLaurin hasn't kind of found that same success. God, I think that this is just like a weird matchup, a tough matchup on both sides, but these guys are just too good to not start. CeeDee Lamb is the number 2 fantasy wide receiver. Buffalo does allow 13th least points per game to wide receivers, but CeeDee Lamb is popping off. He's number 3 with the most receiving yards in NFL, 1,253. He's like 5 yards behind Keenan Allen. He hasn't been under 16 points since week 5. He has 7 touchdowns in the last 7 weeks. He is that guy right now. As for Stephon Diggs, the Cowboys do allow the 7th least points per game to wide receivers. 3 6-point games in the last 4 weeks for him. He has a tough matchup, but he's still the number 1 target in Buffalo. I think that he really needs to bounce back this week. for his own mindset, I don't think he really has much of a choice for himself because he's just that type of player. The Cowboys have allowed the 7th most points per game to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks with a little under 39, and he's looking to ride that momentum after a KC win. He's currently also number 6 in fantasy, so I think that both of these guys will have a big game in a very interesting matchup this week. Another playoff matchup with interesting implications between the Jaguars and the Ravens. And I'm actually going to sit both of these guys. Zay Flowers, surprisingly to a lot of people, I'm going to say him. The Jaguars allow the 8th most points per game to wide receivers with 37.7. They've also allowed tied 3rd most touchdowns to wide receivers with 15. He has 24% of target share in the Ravens offense. That's a lot. However, he only has 3 touchdowns this season, and 2 of those are over the last 2 weeks. He seems pretty touchdown reliant, and he's on a heavy rushing offense. So I really don't see a good reason to start him because I feel like the Ravens are going to run the ball a lot against this Jaguars team. And Calvin Ridley, on the other hand, is very disappointing this season. That's an understatement. He has more single-point games than he has double-digit games. And a lot of people drafted him with their 2nd round pick, their 3rd round pick. So he's just been really, really bad. The Ravens also allow the 2nd least points per game to wide receivers with 31.01. It's disgusting how bad, how little he's scoring right now. Trevor Lawrence is also dealing with an injury. I don't know how that could affect the Jaguars passing game, so it's best to just avoid Calvin Ridley altogether. And last, but certainly not least, you have this very interesting game of Monday Night Football between the Seahawks and the Eagles. You're going to start every single receiver in this game, all 5 of them. Both of these teams are in the top 4 of most points given up to wide receivers over the duration of the entire season. They're in the top 3 of most points given up to wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. These pass defenses, they're horrible. They're terrible. They're not good. You just need to start all of them. This is going to be a battle of who's going to win through the air. And honestly, I feel like this could be based heavily on the QB play. But I think all 5 of these guys have prime opportunities to do well. I think these could all be 15-point per game guys this week. I really do. I'm going to start every single one of them. And that's going to do it for this week's Stardom Situm wide receiver edition for the fantasy playoffs this week. If you guys like this video and want to see more like it, make sure you smash that like button, subscribe, comment if you're new here. If, you guys want to ask some questions, see what my opinions are as to who you should start, make sure you leave it. And I'll catch you guys in the next episode. Peace.